Born on May 31st, 1819, Walt Whitman was the second son of Walter Whitman, a house builder, and Louisa Van Veller. They lived in Brooklyn and Long Island, New York in the 1820s and the 1830s. He was largely self taught. He read vicariously, becoming acquainted with the works of Homer, Dante, Shakespeare, and the Bible. Whitman worked as a printer in New York City until a devastating fire in the printing district demolished the industry. In 1836, at the age of 17, he began his career as a teacher in the one room schoolhouses of Long Island. He continued to teach until 1841 when he turned to journalism as a full time career. He founded a newspaper, Long Islander, and later edited a number of Brooklyn and New York papers. In 1848, Whitman left the Brooklyn Daily Edge to become editor of the New Orleans Crescent. It was in New Orleans that he experienced at first hand the viciousness of slavery in the slave markets of that city. On his return to Brooklyn in the fall of 1848, he founded a Free Soil newspaper, the Brooklyn Freedman, and continued to develop the unique style of poetry that later so astonished Waldo Emerson. At the outbreak of the Civil War, Whitman vowed to live a purged and cleansed life. He wrote freelance journalism and visited the wounded and New York area hospitals. He then traveled to Washington, D.C. in December 1862 to care for his brother who had been wounded in the war. Overcome by suffering of the many wounded in Washington, Whitman decided to stay and work in the hospitals and stayed in the city for 11 years. He took a job as a clerk for the Department of Interior, which ended when the Secretary of the Interior, John James Harlan, discovered that Whitman was the author of Leaves of Grass, which Harlan found offensive. Harlan fired the poet. While in Washington, Whitman would sometimes see President Lincoln in the streets and tip his hat. Lincoln knew of the poet. Years earlier, Lincoln's law partner had carried a copy of Leaves of Grass to the office, where the future president occasionally read the poems out loud. In April 1865, Whitman was in Brooklyn visiting his family and going over proofs for drum taps poems inspired by the war when Lincoln was assassinated. Whitman was devastated. Just as the book was going to the press, he inserted a few short poems about Lincoln's death. A few years later, he wrote a longer elegy called When Lilacs Last and the Dayard Bloom. This poem was inspired by Abraham Lincoln because Walt Whitman inspired him. This poem is titled, "O Captain, My Captain." O Captain, my Captain, our fearful trip is done. The ship has withered every wreck, the prize we sought is won. The port is near, the bells are here, the people are exulting, while follow the eyes of steady Neil, the vessel grim and daring. But oh heart, 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 oh the bloody drops of red, where on the deck my captain lies, falling cold and dead. O Captain, my Captain, rise up and hear the bells. Rise up, for you the flag is flung, for you the bulge trails, for you bouquets and ribbons wreath, for you the shores are crowding, for you that call the swaying mass their eagle faces turning here. O Captain, dear Father, this arm beneath your head. It is some dream that on the deck you have fallen dead. My captain does not answer, his lips are pale and still. My father does not feel my warm arm, he has no pulse nor will. The ship is anchored safe and sound, its voyage close and done. From fearful trip the victor comes in with object won. O Zot, O shores, and ring, O bells, but I have mournful tread. Walk the deck my captain lies, fallen cold and dead.
Captain, my captain. Who knows where that comes from? Anybody? Not a clue. It's from a poem by Walt Whitman about Mr. Abraham Lincoln. Now, in this class, you can either call me Mr. Keating, or if you're slightly more daring, oh, Captain, my captain. Now, let me dispel a few rumors so they don't fester into facts. Yes, I, too, attended Helton. I survived. And no, at that time, I was not the mental giant you see before you. I was the intellectual equivalent of a 98-pound weakling. I would go to the beach, and people would kick copies of Byron in my face.
How important is that objective? Question 1 rates the poem's perfection. Question 2 rates its importance. And once these questions have been answered, determining the poem's greatness becomes a relatively simple matter. If the poem score for perfection is plotted on the horizontal of a graph...
Mr. Keating, they made everybody sign it.
Anderson.
You gotta believe me, it's true.
I do believe you, Tom.
Leave, Mr. Keating.
But it wasn't his fault.
Sit down, Mr. Anderson. One more outburst from you or anyone else, and you're out of this school. Leave, Mr. Keating. I said leave, Mr. Keating.
Captain, my captain.
Sit down, Mr. Anderson. You hear me? Sit down. Sit down. This is your final warning, Anderson. How dare you? You hear me?
Oh, Captain, my captain.
Mr. Overstreet, I warn you. Sit down. Sit down. Sit down. All of you. I want you seated. Sit down.